Hi there. In this video, what I want to do is talk just about a couple of the typical extra features that people use that are a part of jQuery. Now, as you know, jQuery is a big library with a huge set of possibilities for manipulating web pages. But along with the kinds of standard manipulations that we've already seen, like adding or removing elements from a page or setting their CSS, etc., there are a few other things that jQuery lets you do that you'll run into a lot and that are kind of really helpful or just fun to play around with. So I kind of want to review a few of those just so that you know what they are and you've got them in your pocket if you want to do some programming that they would benefit. So without further ado, let's look at some of those other features that are available. To do that, of course, I am going to have an example web page that I'm going to be working on. I've prepared this one earlier. I don't know why it says jQuery events up here. It should say jQuery extras. That's very silly. But the web page itself just looks like this. Okay, so it's just a heading, another heading, a paragraph of text, and a button that I can click. And we're just going to use that to keep things simple and demonstrate what's going on. If we actually look at the HTML itself, of course, you can see I've added jQuery here via their CDN. I have a style sheet. In that style sheet, I have a simple class that I'm just going to use because manipulating classes is something that jQuery makes very easy. And this is just a class that when you add it to an element, it sets its background color to yellow. So it's like a highlighter, basically. Sorry. And then going back to the HTML itself, as we were discussing, it's got a simple H1. It's got a section, and inside the section, an H2 for a subheading, and then a paragraph of text. And then in that section, at the very bottom, is a button. And then, of course, my script is linked. So let's talk about manipulations of this page with other features of jQuery that are worth knowing about. So one of the things that's worth knowing about is how easy it is to add a class to an element or remove a class from an element. And it's as simple as using named methods that are called what you might expect. So if, for example, I wanted to add my highlight CSS class to, let me move that to there. If I wanted to add that to, for example, I don't know, all of my headers, so I know I've got these two headers here that have a class of header, I could select those headers with jQuery in the standard way. So we use the jQuery function, and we select the CSS selector for header. And then I can use a method called addClass that jQuery provides that lets me add any CSS class to an element. So I could add the class called highlight, for example. And that will go away, find everything with the class of header, and add on another class, which is highlight. We go and look at that. We can see that both of these headers now have a yellow background. So the class is being applied to them. And importantly, the class is dynamically applied to them while the page is just sitting there, right? We add the class and they update their appearance. It's really important. The only thing I would say that's important to remember here, when you're specifying the class to add, you don't include the dot here, right? It's sort of tempting to because that's how we're used to using CSS selectors with jQuery. But because this method is already called addClass, it would be redundant to have the dot, right? Because the dot means class as well. So when we say add class, we just give the name, just the name of the class to add. So that's how we can add a class. If we want to remove a class, what would you imagine the method was called? Perhaps you would think that it might be remove class, and you would be correct. So let's say that we also want to be able to remove these classes from headers. So we'll, again, target all of the headers, and we'll add a click event. So on click, run this function. And what will the function do? It will remove the class from the current element that you got clicked on. So this, which targets the current, selects the current element that was the target of the click, remove class, and it works in the same way as add class. You just specify the class to actually remove. So we'll remove the highlight class when we click on a header. So now if I click on the main header, click, the class goes away, and so therefore also the yellow background goes away. Same thing for the subheading. So this is just a really simple, easy way to change the appearance of things, right? Because in adding a class, you're adding a whole bunch of CSS. And a lot of the time, This is kind of a cleaner and nicer way to restyle elements on the page instead of using the CSS method of jQuery. Like I could have done the same thing with CSS, but you can imagine if my highlight CSS was a bit more complicated and involved more elements, it's probably going to be better to separate out those styling concerns into your style sheet in the actual CSS file and just add or remove classes in your script so that you're not talking as much about the specifics of visual appearance here in your script. The other thing that's available to kind of complete this suite of add class, remove class is we can toggle a class, which means that if it's there, it gets removed, and if it's not there, it gets added. So for example, if we wanted to make our background of the headers blink, we could, on an interval, select the header class, and we could toggle the highlight class. So toggle class highlight, and we'll do that every, 500 milliseconds. So now, every 500 milliseconds, we will select all of the headers, all of the things that have the header class, and we'll toggle highlight on them. So again, if it's not there, it will be turned on, the class will be added, and if the class is there, it will be removed. And so you get a blinking effect like this, right? Blink tags, gotta love them. So that's a really easy and good way, I think, a sort of smart way to style elements on the page with CSS is to leave the job of specifying the CSS to your style file, your style.css file, and just add and remove classes from within your script. Now, this same idea of changing, I guess, the CSS of elements on a page, a really classic thing that you often want to do when you're working with a web page is you want to kind of hide or show elements at different times, right? And so the most basic thing that we can do in this vein is we can hide and show things on a web page with jQuery. So if we were doing this with just regular plain JavaScript, we would talk about setting the display property of their CSS to none because that's what would hide it. But with jQuery, we get a special method that lets us do that. So let's do this via the button, because once we start making things disappear, we can't click on them anymore. So it's going to make sense to have a sort of extra thing that we can use to control. So I believe my button's ID is just button. So I'm going to select the button with the jQuery function, and I'm going to listen for clicks on the button. And when the button gets clicked, I'm going to say I want the main heading to disappear. So I'm going to select the main heading, which is by its CSS, main heading, and then the function that we get provided by jQuery is hide. So we say main heading, and then we say .hide. We use the hide method, sorry. And this is actually just the same thing as setting display none, but it's a nice sort of very simple expression of what we're doing, right? Hide the thing that I just selected. So if I click the button now, the main heading disappears. Likewise, obviously, I could hide all of the headings if I selected the header class, and I could hide more than one thing at the same time. Both of them go away, right? So that's useful. Of course, we might want to bring things back. We might want to make things actually display again. The opposite of hide is show. So for example, after we've hidden something when we've clicked on our button, we could also, since I don't have a second button to show things, let me use set timeout, and I will show, I'll show the things again after 2 seconds. So again, I can select the header class, and I can call the show method, right? So I click the button, it hides all of the headers, and then I use set timeout to wait for 2 seconds, and then I show all of the headers again to make them appear back on the screen, on the web page. So click, they go, 1, 2, they come back. That's the show, bringing them back. So that's just useful, right? Because it's very often the case that you want to hide and show elements on a page. If you imagine, for example, different interfaces that you want to show to the user, if you have those inside, for example, a div or a section element, you can hide one of them and show the other, and then when it's time to switch between them, you just hide and show to swap them. That's a nice way of making a multi-screen kind of interface on a single web page. Just as with the add class idea, we can also use toggle to toggle whether or not something is visible. So we could do the same thing here. We could select all the headers when the button is clicked, and we could use this toggle method that toggles the visibility or the display property of everything that's selected. So if I click it once, they disappear, and if I click it again, they come back, and that's the behavior that just stays. So it turns them on and off, basically, which is, again, potentially a very useful thing that you want to be able to do. For example, if you had like a little instructions thing you wanted to show or hide based on the user clicking an information button, this is what you could use, right? You could toggle it so that it comes and goes. jQuery is particularly nice in that it doesn't just provide show, hide, and toggle. It also provides some kind of nice, I don't know, animated, pretty transitions that you can use that follow the same principle. So, for example, we can do all of those same ideas of hiding and showing and toggling, but we can do them with a fade instead. So let's say that I want all of the headers to fade out and then disappear. We can say header fade out. So this is another built-in method in jQuery, and this is an animated transition to things being hidden. So fade out means that I click and, as you saw, they faded and then they disappeared. You can also see that it has that same effect of hiding them, right? So they not only did they fade out in terms of their visibility, when they were fully faded out, they disappeared from the page. That's why the rest of the document kind of shifted back up, because the actual elements, the headers, are not being displayed anymore. If I click it again, obviously nothing happens because they're gone. So that's a fade out. We could do, what do we need to know about this? Oh, so the key things to know about the fade out is, obviously, in this case, we had a default amount of time. It's quite a quick fade. If we provide a single argument here, we can specify how long we want the fade to take in milliseconds. So I could say that I want it to take 5 seconds for them to fade all the way out. And that just does what you would expect, right? I click the button, and over time, 5 seconds is a long time. Here in the future, they fade out and then they, again, disappear. So we can control how long it takes. Maybe that felt like it was too long. The other thing that we can do is, if we provide a second argument, we can provide a function. And this function here, this callback, will be called when the fade out has completed. So when this sort of animation has finished, it will call this function, and that way we can do something at the moment that the header has finished fading out, the headers have finished fading out, and in this instance, why don't we fade them back in, right? So we can select them again, and yes, as you might imagine, the way that you specify to fade something in is you write fade in, and we'll let them take the same amount of time. So now I click the button, and I'm aware that I have nested anonymous functions here. Hopefully it still feels pretty readable to you. So when I click on the button, I do this, which is that the headers all fade out over 2.5 seconds, and when that finishes, I call this function, which fades them back in over 2.5 seconds. And so we get the effect I think you were probably expecting. They fade out, and then they instantly fade back in. And there's no moment where they completely disappear, which is kind of nice. You don't get a jarring kind of bounce on the page where the elements are completely gone and then they come back again. So that's a nice way that we can have things fading in and out. Lovely. It's worth knowing that in here, when we're inside this fade out callback, this function that gets called when the fade out is completed, we can actually use this in here like we do for event handlers. So this inside the handler for a fade out refers to the thing that got faded out. So in this case, this would refer to each of the elements with the header class. That can just lead to some slightly nicer programming potentially. So again, it'll have the same behavior, right? It fades all the way out, and then they fade all the way back in. But it's just worth knowing that we can use that same idea of this inside an animation callback. This refers to the thing being animated. And I guess, as you might imagine, there is also fade toggle, which we can do as well. So fade toggle means that each time we click the button, it either fades it out if it's visible, or it fades it in if it's not visible. So I click it once, they fade out, I click it again, and they fade back in. And so we toggle backwards and forwards between whether or not they're displayed with a fading effect. There's one other one that jQuery has built in that's worth seeing, which is the slide transitions, and they work in exactly the same way. So there's slide in, there's slide out, and there is slide toggle, and they work in exactly the same way. It just is a sliding effect instead. And it slides up and slides down, my bad. We'll look at all of them. So if I click it now, you can see that the way that it works is that the sort of bounding boxes of the elements contract and hide them, right? So that's quite a nice effect as well, right? Yes. And if, again, I was incorrect about what I said. So it's slide up, for example. Slide up, for example, is how you make something disappear with this sliding. So if I click now, they will slide up and therefore disappear, and then they're gone because there's nothing else. And again, I could do that same idea. I could, for example, use a set timeout here, and we could wait for a... we'll add the same idea here. So we can add a callback here, which will be called when the slide up is finished. And here we could do, this dot slide down, which will make them appear again. Let's make it frighteningly fast, 500 milliseconds. So they slide up sort of languorously, and then they suddenly slide down and give you a jump scare. So you're sort of very relaxed, everything's fine, and then, they come back. That's too slow. Let's make it scarier than that. Was that scary? Not really, but if you had a big sound effect. If you had like a big synth hit or something there, it might be scary. Maybe I'm flattering myself that would be scary. So again, same idea, just transitions, ways of making things disappear with a bit of an animation if you're wanting some flair. Of course, you can build more complicated animations of your own, and that is the subject of our next very useful method in jQuery to know, which is that there is a method called Animate, and what Animate does is it lets us animate any CSS properties that are based on numbers, effectively. So the way that Animate works, let's do it again, we'll do it via our button. So I'll select our button and listen for clicks on that button. And if I want to animate something, I use the Animate method. So again, I'll target our good old header class, and we say Animate, that's the name. And what do we provide to animate? Two things. The first thing that we provide is a list of CSS properties to actually animate. So I'm going to animate, remember these need to be numbers, so opacity is a number. I'm going to animate that to, 0.5. And I'm going to also animate the font size to 3 rem, so it's going to get bigger. The other argument that I need is how long I want this animation to last by default. So let's say that that's 2 seconds. So what are we saying here? We're saying select the headers, we know that there are 2 of them, and animate them. And we want to animate these properties here, which is opacity and font size, specified according to their CSS property names, to the target values here. So we happen to know that the opacity right now is 1, so it's going to animate down to 0.5. Font size is going to animate up to 3 rem. And we provide the amount of time we want that to take place over, 2 seconds in this case. So if we click, they get bigger and they get fadier. And that's how that is literally, that's what Animate is for. It's for animating to target CSS properties. Very, very powerful. Quite an amazing thing to be able to do with such a small amount of code. And maybe if you've struggled before with animating things in plain JavaScript, just using the DOM, you will very much appreciate just how straightforward this is. It's important to remember that Animate doesn't work on everything. In particular, for example, it only works on things that are obviously numbers with units. That means, for instance, you can't animate colors because it's a little bit more of a complicated representation. You can animate colors if you use the jQuery UI library, which we will talk about. You also, for example, can't animate the transform property in a simple way because it's a bit overly complicated for the way that Animate works. It's worth also knowing that the Animate method can take a third argument here. So we've given it the CSS properties to animate to and the amount of time. If we provide a third thing, we can provide a function, and this will be the function, as you might maybe be able to guess, that will be called when the animation has finished. So this is the callback when it has completed. So for example, and again we can use this to specify the element that is being animated. We could tell them all to say animated or something like that. That's kind of stupid, but all of them will perform their animation with their original text, and then when it's finished, their text will change to say animated. Let's look at that. So they change, and then they both say animated because that callback is being called when they finish. So this is kind of like, as I look at this, I'm like, yeah, that's kind of like a bit naughty. There's quite a bit going on here. This is very good practice, I think. The way to think about this is very good practice for kind of unpicking the different components of this. So, for example, all of the selection that I have here is the function that gets called when there is a click. You could, of course, move this into a named function if you want to, and if that leads to things feeling clearer for you, then I advise you to do so. It's just often the case that for these occasions where the functions that you're calling are fairly small and short, you will often see people using anonymous functions like this. So this is the function that's called when there's a click. Then we have an animate method in there that's animating, and then this is the function that's called when the animate method is finished. Because in actual fact, all of this stuff here, from this opening curvy bracket or parenthesis to this one here, is all the arguments that we're providing to the animate method. Okay, so we can do some pretty sophisticated stuff with animate, I think, as you might imagine. It's actually even more flexible than this if we call it in a slightly different way. So let's do that. So I'm going to delete the things that I was providing to animate. The other way that we can call animate is we can provide it just with two arguments. One is still going to be the properties to animate to. So again, let me animate the opacity to something small, and I'll also animate the, what am I talking about? Let me animate the height to something. I'll animate the height to 200 pixels. I don't know if this is a good idea, but I've done it now. So that's an animation. This will take place over a default amount of time because I didn't specify anything. So you can see that because these things change height, they kind of change the configuration of the page there. They fade out and they get taller. They take up more room. Instead of providing a time and then comma and then a function, we can actually also provide a second object that just has all of the settings that we want to deal with for this animation. And to see all of them, you should read the documentation for the animate method. But a couple of useful ones, obviously you might want to be able to set the duration since we're writing this in a different format. So if I want this to take 10 seconds, for example, I set a duration property on the second object, and that will affect how long it takes. So now it's slowly getting bigger and slowly fading out. Agonizing. You could imagine a really slow web page. Maybe that would be kind of fun to play around with. Let me, for now, make it slightly faster. If you're wanting to provide that function that gets called when it's finished, you create a property called complete, and that is what you can call. That's where you can put your function that will do something amazing at the end, such as, again, setting the text to something like animated, which is what we did before. That's the name of that function, is the complete function. So again, up we go, and then they change to animated here. And then there's a bunch of other stuff. There's other callback functions that you can add. I won't go into them just because I think we'll get in the weeds. But another thing that's particularly worth knowing about is the easing property, which lets you change kind of the style of animation. You can see that the default behavior is that it has a little bit of easing of the animation at the start and the end. It's kind of ramps up into the full animation speed and then gradually ramps down to stopping. But for example, if you just wanted it to be a completely linear animation with no ramping at all, you can specify an easing value like linear to make that happen. So now you can see it's kind of more robotic, right? It was just a linear style of animation. So play around with that, of course. So just remember, though, that animate can only be applied to kind of straightforwardly numerical properties like opacity, height, width, font size, those kinds of things. Other things that you might desperately want to animate, like a transform, are a little bit more complicated, and you can, in fact, use animate on them, but not in a straightforward way. And likewise, you can't animate colors by default in jQuery. You need to use the jQuery UI library to handle that, which is already kind of worth its weight in gold. So that's the animate method. Very powerful way to animate CSS properties. There's just one more thing I actually want to kind of look at, and that is a method called each. So I just want us to know about this. What each does is it lets us call a function on each element in a selection, kind of like looping through them with a for loop, but it's a bit faster and it's native to jQuery. So if you imagine, again, that we're selecting the header class, right? We know that there are two things with the header class, which is this header and this header here. So if I wanted to do something to all of the things with the header class on this page, what I would do is I would use this each method. So I'm saying I want to do something to each of the things that I selected. In this case, there are two. And what do I want to do? How do I specify what I want to do? Well, you're familiar enough with JavaScript now to know that this is going to be a function. So we're going to call a function on each of the things that get selected by our selector here, header. And what do I want to do? Well, anything really. In this instance, let's do the old reverse text trick. So the reverse text of reverse text is going to be, first of all, we select the thing that we're talking about. So we can refer to, because this is like looping through each of the headers, this will always refer to the current one that it's looking at, right? So we can select this one that is being looked at in each. And the first, in the each, it will first do this one, and the lorem ipsum one will be the this, and then it will get to the second one, and $sit amit will be the this. So it will handle both of them. Then we can select the text that's inside the current header. And then we can, again, the usual kind of incantation, we can split it into an array of individual characters, reverse that array so it's backwards, and then join the array back in so that it is, again, just a string, except that now it's the backwards version. And then finally, we can set the text of the current header that we're looking at inside this each to be the reversed text. So if we go and look at our page now, you can see lorem ipsum is backwards, and so is $sit amit. So we get must be merol and timatis rolod, classic backwards Latin words. So the key thing here is, right, that each is allowing us to call a function that will apply to each of the things that match our header, and inside that function, this refers to the current element that is being matched. So we can do stuff to everything that matches a specific selection. That can be a very powerful way to do arbitrary things to a whole bunch of things on a web page with just one function. That kind of concludes what I want to talk about. The only thing that I do want to quickly mention, because it's kind of amazing, is that if I just go, I'm just going to go over to the jQuery documentation, and in particular, I want to point out that jQuery has this documentation about selectors specifically. So we've already seen that in jQuery we largely select things by just using standard CSS selectors, which is great and incredibly powerful already. But just so that you know, if you're needing to do even more sophisticated selection techniques of things that are on the page, jQuery provides a whole bunch of extra sophisticated ways of selecting things that aren't just available by default in standard CSS selection. I'm not going to go into these, there's a lot of them as you can see, but just by way of example, right, we can see that we can use this animated selector, but in a way that interacts with jQuery itself, which is that it will find any element on the page that is currently being animated, which could be a really interesting thing to be able to work with. So be aware of that. It's a whole brave new world of thinking about what you could possibly do. Standard CSS selection is, generally speaking, going to be enough for a lot of projects, but it's just worth knowing that there is a more sophisticated level available through jQuery if you actually want to use it. That concludes a sort of rough and ready introduction to some of the extra things that jQuery can allow you to do. We've kind of looked at transitions, hiding and showing things, and then also fading them in and out, and sliding them in and out, which is really nice. We looked at CSS animation via jQuery with the Animate method, and we looked at the very powerful each method to apply a function to the entire, every member of a selection that you select using jQuery. Those things are really, really interesting ways to make quite sophisticated programs out of web pages. I hope you enjoy them. Hope you play around with them. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.